Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe.
Tell me about the New Year's Eve 2015 resolution that you made.
Well, on that New Year's Eve, I decided to not to buy anything for a whole year. So just for the 12 months that would come, I wouldn't buy anything. Well, not exactly anything. I made two exceptions. I allowed myself, I had these two rules. I was not supposed to die and I was not supposed to start stinking. And these were the two rules. So I was still allowed to buy food. It's hard to go without that. And I was still allowed to buy things like soap or shampoo or, all of that stuff. But these were the two exceptions. And other than that, I didn't buy anything, any products for a whole year. And what caused me to do that, or where the idea came from, shortly before that, I was on holiday on Bali, which is supposed to be a paradise. And in many respects it is. But if you walk along the shore there, along the sea, it's really, it's plastic. Like the whole shoreline is covered with waste. And except for the few resorts that just have people clean it up. But other than that, it's all covered in like a myriad of products that come from all the corners of the world, I guess, just washed up on the shore there. And it's really, it was a frightening sight. And I just thought, this is complete madness. And yeah, we have to kind of change something. This doesn't make sense.
So perhaps it's worth me kind of underscoring what you've just said. So you've gone on holiday to Bali, you've seen a load of plastic all over the shoreline, and then perhaps you've come home, you've had some time to reflect on this, and then you've come up with a challenge for not to buy anything with the exception of don't die and don't stink for an entire year. To most people, that sounds like a pretty crazy challenge, man.
Well, it may sound a little bit crazy, but it's actually a very easy thing to do. And I have a number of friends who tried the same thing after I did, and it worked for me. It worked for them. It's not hard to do, actually, once you get used to it. You just have to get used to saying no to the constant bombardment of offers that we all get from all sides. So if you walk down the street and you see all these things left and right that look attractive in the shop windows, you just have to actually, the technique that I developed over time was to treat them not as offers, but as a tax on my personal integrity, almost. So instead of saying, don't I buy it, I try to sell me something that I don't actually need. So if I say no, that's actually, for me, that's like a yes. And so once you practice that, you end up walking the streets in like constant triumph, like no, yes. I said yes, I said no to another thing that I don't really need. And once you learn that, once you're in that mindset, it gets very easy, and you don't miss much.
So like you turned it into a kind of a game with yourself. You said to yourself, oh, if I'm going down the street, I can kind of instead of seeing this as something as a temptation, I can play this game with myself, and instead of being at the mercy of them, I can kind of score points with myself and avoid being caught up into buying this or into buying that.
Exactly. So I think it's probably a version of what they call gamification. That's the buzzword, right? You have to gamify everything, and yeah, to an extent, that's what I did, and it works really well. And the other thing that I should mention is that I didn't buy products anymore, but I didn't spend less money, or maybe only slightly, because I just, instead of spending it on products, I started spending it on services. So instead of buying a new shirt, I would I would get a new haircut instead, buying the service of the hairdresser, etc. So and this is an interesting thing, I think, because it kind of refers to this concept of decoupling, that an economy can, at least in theory, I think nobody's really pulled it off so far in practice, but it's possible, or it must be. An economy could grow without growing resource consumption. So that's possible if all you need is, or the majority of what you spend your money on is services and not physical goods, then that's what you end up with. So that's kind of the thought behind it. And so I still spent quite a bit of money, but not necessarily on the same things that I would have spent it a year before.
During this period, I guess, of abstinence, just looking at some kind of things that like you couldn't buy. So for instance, you couldn't go to IKEA and buy a new coffee table. You couldn't go out and buy a new pair of jeans, assumingly, unless all your other jeans had been ruined. You know, you couldn't go and buy the latest iPad. Am I on the right lines with those types of things?
Exactly so. Yeah. This is pretty much what I did or what I didn't do. And regarding iPads, or back at the time, I remember I had a friend who bought the same iPhone, actually it came in two sizes, and he bought both of them. And because he told me he wasn't sure which size, he couldn't yet tell which size he'd actually prefer. So he decided to buy both. And that, I just thought, that's madness. And I wasn't any better, actually. I remember buying the same coat around the same time. I bought the same coat twice. Once in a color that was kind of, I think it was called slate gray or something, and the other color was called mud, something like that. So it was the same coat, and I just bought it twice, and that's just stupid, you know. And so I stopped doing that. And yeah, went a little more radical for a year, but ever since I have, after that year, eventually you have to start buying stuff again. But then I came up with a new rule, which is whenever I buy something new, it has to replace something old. And by old, I mean something old that is either like broken or just used up. So the overall amount of stuff that I have at home that I own isn't growing. Wow. I even do the same thing with books, by the way, which is like my bookshelf has, like any bookshelf, its size is limited, and whenever I buy a new book, I have to pull out an old one, the one that I like least, or that I won't miss that much, and just throw it away or give it to somebody else.
Yeah, and it's interesting for me because when I watched your TED talk, which is absolutely fantastic, by the way, I'll put a link below, is that I was thinking about some of the consumeristic tendencies that I have, and quite similar to yourself. Books would be a massive one. New gym clothing. This is one of the things that I somehow conditioned myself in when I was younger, and it's turned out to be quite an unhelpful thing in some ways, but in some ways it hasn't. When I was trying to get myself into the habit of going to the gym at a young age, I found that if I wouldn't buy new gym clothes, then it would kind of work as some sort of a habit loop trigger to motivate me to go to the gym. And it works. In short periods, it works. But what happened over time was, instead of, I guess, confronting my own issues of discipline or a real love for exercise, what happened was it kind of worked as a band-aid, as a paracetamol, and it ended up with me having an absolute mountain of these clothes to go to the gym with. So much so that, it was almost impossible at one point to get into this one bedroom I had, because it was just full of gym clothing. So that was something which I kind of had to mask over. Another thing was iPhones, or Macs, which, by the way, is a very, very expensive consumer thing. And it's funny because a couple of days ago, my iPhone broke, so I kind of took it upon myself to kind of take a step back. And at the moment, I'm using a very old iPhone. So, you know, you've saved me a few £1,000, I would imagine, in the short term. So thank you very much.
Well, that's kind of you to say that, but it's interesting what you say about the clothes, because you said you, like in theory, you'd need them for the gym. And there's quite a bit of research that the kick you get out of purchasing something like that, piece of clothing or just any good, the kick you get out of that purchase is much shorter lived than the reward that you get out of an experience. So from actually going to the gym and doing whatever you do there. So that's what you really should be focusing on, because it just in terms of the happiness that gives you and the permanence of that, experiences are much more rewarding than the kicks we get out of just buying this or buying that. So yeah.
Right. And I guess this goes to kind of the neurochemical dopamine, which is that, you know, you buy something that, you know, you think that you need, it releases this big amount of dopamine. And then what happens is that to get the same amount of dopamine, you can't just buy the same thing. You have to take it up a new level. It's the bigger house. It's the newer car. It's the newer Armani suit. It's the latest iPhone. And what happens is that you found yourself in a trap, a cycle that is very hard to get out of. And it's also very expensive, right?
Yeah, that's definitely the case. You could compare it to sugar in a way. You know, if you eat something sugary, that'll boost your, like everything, your system for a couple of minutes, but then it quickly drops again. And the opposite is true for true, like rewarding experiences, which you may remember your whole life and have a much more long-lasting effect. But I have, you know, I live in Switzerland, and we're probably, we can basically afford whatever we want. You know, it's one of the richest countries in the world, and you just get used to doing that. I have lots of friends whom I like dearly, and who are really close friends. But their behavior when it comes to consuming stuff is if you look at it from some distance, you have to say it's absurd. You know, it's totally absurd. And yeah, that might be changing now anyway. At least I hope it will. Like we might be forced to cut down a bit on the things that we're all used to.
Absolutely, man. So let's, I guess, circle back. So you kind of mentioned that you had these rules: don't stink, don't die, which I find pretty, seems like pretty solid rules. So let me kind of ask you then, to the person listening that says, you know, wow, that sounds so difficult, like that could never be me. What would you say was kind of the hardest part of the challenge? Like, were there certain things that you kind of missed out on buying, that when it was during that time that you thought, oh, you know, I would love that latest MacBook Air or that latest IKEA coffee table? What was the hardest part?
Well, as I've said, it really, after a little bit of practice, it's not hard at all. You just get into a new mindset, and that's it. And from then on, it's easy. What might have been, what I really did miss, one thing that I would have loved to buy at that time was a new pair of skis, because I'm an avid skier, and I saw these skis, and they were exactly the ones that I wanted, and so I just had to postpone that for a year or so. That was something that I missed. But once you decide not to buy them, you just go on, and you kind of accept it. And the other thing that I started missing after a while was socks. because I only had so many pairs, and yeah, that really that also kind of there was some danger of violating that don't stink rule, because if you just if you're out of socks, then yeah, sooner or later you're in trouble. So after that year, I was kind of glad that I could go back to buying new socks.
Were there any? I'd be interested to know kind of how this impacted your social life. Did your social life benefit? Were there any social costs? How did that pan out?
No costs, but benefits, yes, because like as I've mentioned before, I started spending more money and more time on experiences, and that includes like going out, seeing friends, going to concerts, cinema, whatever, public events, and so I actually started going out more often. There's just, I think, a lot of people these days who buy too much or are in this habit of just constantly buying stuff, do that in a very lonely setting, like at home in front of their computers, purchasing stuff online, which even adds to the tragedy of it in some way, because it's really, yeah, like the kick you get out of that is really short-lived, and it's you're just at home, you click and you buy it, and you're happy for a couple of minutes, and then it fades, and that's the opposite of going out and seeing people and spending time with others, and which is obviously much more rewarding. So yeah, no costs there at all. I would say that was a very healthy thing to do, also in terms of personal relationships with others.
It seems like yeah. Oh, please go on.
And it's a good conversation starter also, because I wrote when I decided to do that experiment, I wrote an article in a newspaper about it, and then everybody like asked about that, and it was really a good conversation starter with lots of people.
What would you say some of the other benefits, and I wonder if it actually led to perhaps any other areas of your life? Like, did you find that you were more disciplined? Were there any psychological benefits I'd be interested to know about?
Yes, I would say so. Yeah, because it doesn't just what you save is not just money, but you also save time and how should I say that, attention. Like if you're naturally interested or caught by anything you see that you could potentially buy, that eats up a lot of your like attention capacity for attention. And once you start disregarding all that stuff, you're in a much more relaxed, calmer state of mind. So I would say that that was beneficial too, definitely. And then there's the social aspect. In terms of money itself, as I've said, I personally didn't really spend much less during that year. But you could very well do that if I just substituted the things that I didn't, the goods that I didn't buy with services, with that kind of thing. But if you don't do that, you'll end up with a lot more money. You can actually probably save quite a bit of money.
Yeah, and in terms of like the kind of the decluttering, this is one of the things that I know a number of other people. I know Lewis, my co-host, he's interviewed people about this on the show.
Yeah,
owning less stuff for some reason, for whatever reason, it seems to have tremendous psychological benefits. I always find myself that whenever I'm on a mental health decline, I look around and my car will be a mess, my bedroom will be a mess, but there seems to be something inherently psychologically rewarding about less. But it's a paradox, because kind of in the West, we're taught that the way to happiness, the way to fulfillment, the way to, living a good life is more. The idea that less can make you satisfied, that doesn't seem to be what we're taught.
Yeah, that is true. It's obviously true, but then again, it's probably no coincidence that I started that experiment like a couple of years ago, because there's at the same time, and there still is, there's a huge wave of books and people talking about similar stuff, like there's this whole trend. I'm sure you're familiar with Marie Kondo, like what's her book called, The Art of Tidying, I think. So there's this trend, and you have people on social media advertising their tiny houses. There's this whole minimalism trend, and that's certainly no coincidence. There seems to be a yearning for owning less, and having to deal with less. I think it's also about that. It's amazing if you look at. I was on holiday this summer in Austria, and we were at this monastery from the Baroque period, which is one of the biggest and most impressive in the world from that era. And it was just overwhelming. Like, all the frescoes, the paintings in there. It was absolutely, it's fantastic, but it's totally overwhelming. And I just thought, today nobody would remotely think about creating and painting something like that. If you look at what the buildings that are that we deem the best and most aesthetically pleasing today, and they're quite different from what they did in the 17th century. So and that's no coincidence. I think we're just being overwhelmed with stuff, with information also, not just physical stuff. And and so that's what I did and what others do is a reaction to that, I guess.
There's a quote that I love that says, "We buy things that we don't need with money we don't have to impress people that we don't like." And kind of looking at your stuff, it kind of makes me think about, consumerism as a whole. And I admit, this is one of the reasons why I'm, I don't want to put any shame on anyone listening to this, because I have a friend that, every time I see him, he has, a brand new Ralph Lauren top or the finest shoes. And I go, wow, internally I'm thinking, I could do with that myself. I resist it for the most part, of course, but I see it, whatever reason, there's a psychological temptation inside that I see, and I think, I like that, and I see other people, they like it as a social, it's a social signal. But I'd love to kind of know, clearly there must be some sort of psychological software within us that, makes us perhaps a little bit jealous to other members. But I'd love to kind of know, what do you think some of the reasons are why we kind of get into this, this consumerism, this kind of never enough, always on to the next thing, the new iPhone, the new Jordans, etc. What do you think some of the reasons would be?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's probably really, as you say, it's somehow hardwired, and you have to actively kind of try and unlearn it, because it's probably natural for us to want more all the time. Like, it's like if you have a dog and you feed it, the dog will just eat as much as there is. It won't stop, and I think that the same is probably true for our close relatives. Like, some gorilla will just eat as many bananas as he can find, and doesn't just stop. And so I think that's probably a natural thing. We just want to, as long as stuff is available and there, you better grab the opportunity, and you better profit from it. Yeah, who knows how long it lasts? And that was true for the longest time. We lived in an environment where that was really like a mindset that you had to have in order to survive, and that's no longer the case. And that's probably the reason why it might be difficult to kind of revert the tendency there, which is what I tried. But it's possible. And in terms of the social aspect of it, you're absolutely right. I mean, most people or many people buy stuff in order to impress other people, but it's also possible, like buying stuff or a superfluous amount of stuff isn't the only way to impress other people. You can also impress them, like you basically impress people with your behavior, and as soon as they want to model your behavior, then you're really impressing them. Then you have an impact on them, and you can impress people with the opposite too. I mean, you can get looks or reactions from people who think, well, I would love to try that too, and I wonder whether I could do that too, and so on. So it works the other way around too. You don't necessarily have to be in that consumerist mode in order to get attention or from others. That's not necessary.
I guess thinking about to that point is, what type of people are you trying to impress? What type of people do you want in your life? And I get,
yeah, exactly. I mean, those people that you already mentioned that famous quote, I wonder who is it by. I've heard it too, that we try to impress people that we don't really need in our lives, and certainly the ones that you can easily impress by just your latest purchase, that's probably not going to be your best friend for life anyway. I mean, there has to be something else between you and that other person in order to make this a real worthwhile friendship. Just showing each other the latest purchases is probably not going to, that's not the basis for any good relationship, I would argue. So, if you think about your best friends, even the friend you've mentioned, there's probably a lot more going on there, right? It's not just that you're impressed by his latest by his new shirt, and that's what, and the other stuff is what really counts. It's not. As soon as you're close to somebody, really close to somebody, other things start to matter, and you start to also disregard the superficial things. I would say.
Absolutely, and it's funny because I was looking through. I was thinking back about kind of old marketing books that I read, and there was one book by the Harvard business professor Gerald Zaltman. And he kind of argues, or I assume based on some sort of research, that about 95% of our purchase-making decisions happen in the subconscious mind. So if what he's saying is true, there's only 5% of the things that we buy are these conscious, rational thoughts that we've gone, okay, my shoes, they're coming to the end. Maybe I should go out and buy, a new pair of shoes. So that implies then that the other 95%, as you said, I'm sitting at home on a Thursday night and, I'm feeling a little bit sad and I'm feeling a little bit lonely for a pickup. Maybe I should go and buy something new off Amazon. And perhaps that also goes to the heart of what this is about. We're emotional creatures, and these little 2-click buys can give us some kind of boost. What do you kind of think about that only 5% of our decisions that we make are kind of rational, thoughtful decisions?
I'm sure that's true, but it's also absolutely possible to change that. You just have to force yourself, like Marie Kondo does that with I'm sure you're familiar with that. She asked that question when it comes to throwing stuff away, right, to cleaning up your house or apartment. She asks this question: Does it spark joy? That's her question, and if the answer is no, then you kiss it goodbye, say thanks, and and throw it away, basically, if I understood that correctly. And the question here, when it comes to buying stuff, would be, do I need it? Like, does this replace something that I need? And you just have to make it a principle, like so many things in life. I think once you make it a principle, that also eases the burden of like the decision making, the constant decision making. Once you have your principle, you just have to apply it. You no longer have to ponder on it for hours every time. It's easy. It becomes easier. That's what I found. And if you do that, if you make it a principle, don't really think about it anymore. Just say, is it this or that? Do I need it or don't I? Then it becomes much easier, and then you can actually fight that tendency that the marketing professor you mentioned talks about. I'm sure he's right that in our normal states of mind, that's probably true. It's probably 95% is just intuitive, and has nothing to do with a rational, like an actual need for something.
Man, I love that. And I think probably this is a great place to kind of transition into, I guess, actually strategies that people can use if they've listened to kind of what we said and they think, maybe I would love to kind of give this a try. And, we can kind of, as we kind of talked about some of the benefits, I guess obviously for one is if you're in any kind of financial predicaments, then this is one way obviously to spend less money. There's that benefit. You can kind of break the cycle of, I know the common phrase, keeping up with the Joneses, but you can kind of break that consumer cycle. And kind of you talked about something very useful today. And I was thinking back about some things that I think were useful that perhaps could be used in this instance. Two things that I think in my life have been particularly useful. First one is Derek Sivers. He wrote a book called Hell Yeah or Hell No. And I think that could be actually a good use in this instance. If you look at something and it's I may as well just buy it. That would fall into the no category. If it's not a hell yeah, then use it as a no. But the other one was, and this is just one thing that I've thought about as I've kind of been talking to you, is that clearly there's some sort of psychological kind of band-aid that buying things can put on our emotions. So if we say to ourselves, okay, well, I want this thing now, but what if I wait? Whether that's a day or 3 days, will I still want it in a week? Will I still want it in 2 weeks? And fair enough, if you come back in 2 weeks and say, no, I still want this, maybe you should buy it. But if you wait 2 weeks, I imagine that probably 90% of the things that you want will kind of fall away. So I'd love to know kind of what would some strategies be that you could advise people that they've listened to this. They say, this sounds useless, sounds like a really good challenge. It's great for me. It's great for the environment, great for my social life, great for me psychologically. What would be some kind of strategies that people could use?
I think the hell yes strategy is a good one. I haven't heard that, but I think that might work very well. For instance, if you try, or if you say you see a shirt and you like it and think that could be my new shirt, I could buy that. Maybe it's one thing you could ask yourself at that point is this shirt as good and as good looking as will I look as good in that shirt as I currently do in the best shirt that I have at home, even just as good or even better. And if the answer is no, then don't bother buying it. That might be, so it has to be you have to be really enthusiastic about something. And the other thing, what is interesting, you mentioned this tendency to, what was it about the Joneses? There's that English saying.
Keeping up with the Joneses, keeping up with the Joneses.
Keeping up with the Joneses, exactly. And I think in scientific terms, there's this term, this concept of, I think it's called hedonistic treadmill, which is that you're constantly like your life is improving and improving and improving, but it doesn't really make you any happy, like materially improving, but it doesn't make you any happier, because what really makes you happy, or what really matters in terms of happiness, is how you compare yourself to others. And if your neighbor has something new and then you decide to get the same thing just to keep up, that's a never-ending story, and doesn't really lead to happiness. And that's the hedonistic treadmill, I believe. And one way of escaping that is that you have to find new friends. You have to, it matters greatly who you're comparing yourself with. And if you change that, and maybe then there's a possibility that you can reframe the whole situation. And that's a really interesting thing, that really what matters in terms of happiness is comparison to others, and not necessarily the absolute level of what you have or where you stand in terms of material possessions and welfare, etc. So that might be one other strategy to really compare yourself to the right people and spend time with the right people, and then if their thinking is somehow similar to yours, that might be a beneficial thing to do.
And there's absolutely no doubt in what you said, that the people that you bother with will have some sort of impact on me. Like for instance, with my friend I kind of described, for whatever reason, it makes me want to go and buy the latest clothes. So that is absolutely, 100% true. I think as well that just kind of in terms of this, it just seems startling to me that the amount of kind of overall benefits that could be attained, and for relatively little cost, but it just kind of comes at the I guess the task of trying to override your psychological software, so to say. Yeah,
it's amazing how much can change once you decide to give it a try, or even if you're forced to. I mean, we have the situation currently, which I think is very, very interesting, also from a psychological viewpoint, in Europe, where we have this energy crisis, and suddenly policies that have been proposed and advertised and pushed for years, or even for decades, when it comes to environmentalism, for instance, saving energy, or making the switch from fossil fuels to renewable ones, etc. That has been going on for ages, and nothing really, not nothing, but little has happened actually in terms of concrete action. And now that we're suddenly kind of forced to change something there, now suddenly we realize, actually, it's possible. And something similar happened during the pandemic. It was for years, governments around for decades, governments around the world said how much they would have to save, like in terms of money, like we can't afford this, we can't afford that, which we simply don't have the money to do this or to do that. And that might have been I'm not arguing against that in any like politically, but then the pandemic came and cost us an awful lot of money, and suddenly the money might not have been there, but we just decided to print it, and now we have the money. So it's it was just funny, like that stuff that were way too expensive suddenly became absolutely doable. And this just shows that if you're forced to change your behavior, or if you yourself decide to just change it, a lot is possible. It's not once you revert the trend, things can change pretty fast.
Human nature in a nutshell, I guess, which kind of goes back to what we talked about today. Matt, I'd love to kind of ask you a couple of questions, kind of switch it up a little bit. I'm really interested kind of about your profession, which, you know, for those that kind of don't know, you do a lot of work with books, which has been a major theme for the show throughout the years. I'd love to kind of know, do you have any kind of book recommendations that you would love to share with our audience?
Yeah, I should explain about books. I basically I have a day job which is all about reading, to simplify it somewhat. So I work for a company that summarizes books. Get Abstract is the name of the company, and what we do there is we summarize nonfiction books. So we summarize them on 5 pages or so. So instead of spending 10 hours reading a book, you'll read the summary, and that'll cost you 10 minutes or 15 minutes maybe. And so that's what I do for a living. And in my spare time, I write, but there I don't write, or mostly don't write nonfiction, but fiction. So I have these two sides. I like during the day I read, and at night on weekends I write. So that's my relation to books. But in terms of recommendations, I'm trying to remember something that I read recently, or that we summarized recently at Get Abstract. I think there was one called, which comes back to what we were discussing earlier. We've summarized a book called The Art of Saying No. I think the author is called Damon Zahariadis or something like that. That's his name, I think. And that's a brilliant book. That's really about how we all struggle to say no, but have to say no more often. And he basically tells you how to say no to people without feeling like an asshole. That's what he does. And the other one that I remember from last week, something that we've recently summarized, is a very old book called Public Opinion. That's a classic by Walter Lippmann, like one of the like an ad man, actually, a marketing guru of the earliest generation. I think it was published in 1922. Public Opinion, and that's really about democracy. That's about how public opinions are formed in democracies, and that's obviously a topic that couldn't be more, something that couldn't be more topical today. And so I can really recommend rereading that one, even though it's exactly 100 years old. Public Opinion, it's called. It's a fascinating book, and he says a lot of things that are just describes a lot of things that we see in action today. Walter Lippmann. And privately, I'm currently reading a lot of stuff about Tibet, because I'm writing this new book, which one of the main characters there has a Tibetan background. So I'm trying to learn a lot about Tibetan Buddhism and that whole culture, which is fascinating. And one of the books that I'm currently reading there, it's probably not the most scientifically grounded one, but it's an interesting book nevertheless. It's called The Lost Horizon by your fellow Englishman, James Hilton. He wrote that in the 30s, I think. It's that book that introduced the idea of like a hidden kingdom, Shangri-La, somewhere up there in the Himalayas. It's quite a fascinating novel, very well written. I first thought it would just be easy to consume and just a light read, but there's actually quite some depth in it.
Last question that we sign off all our podcasts with is, what makes a life worth living?
Well, that's the that's the big question. Yeah, what does make life worth living? That's so hard. That's so hard. I wasn't aware that that was always your last question. Otherwise, I would have.
I should have told you.
Yeah. What makes life worth living? Is it really? It might really be all about how you're surrounded with, have to somehow see some value in who you are and what you do, and I think you have to find something that you can kind of contribute, that you can bring to the table, and if that's the case, people will love you for it and care about you, and you'll get something in return from them. And I think if you can, I think that might be one of the main tasks that we all have to deal with, is find something, like ask yourself, what is my contribution here? What can I, what could that be? And that the answer might be something completely different for each of us. But once you can answer that, I think you're probably bound to be happy most of the time.
Amazing answer, man. Where can these guys connect with you? And is there anything that you'd like these guys to check out, or send them anywhere?
Like I'm on the usual social media platforms, Instagram, YouTube, where you're big, where your podcast is big, and Facebook also, Twitter. And then I have my own homepage, stoifberg.com. There you can find links to most of the stuff that I do. I think that's mainly it.
We will link everything below. Everybody listening on an audio platform can just swipe up and they can get all those links that we've talked about today, including Niko's TED Talk. Everybody listening on YouTube can just click the link in the description. Man, I've really, really enjoyed this. There's been so much food for thought. Some of the very tactical kind of things that we got into, the kind of even the philosophical, the scientific underpinnings of why we did why we do what we do, and kind of, I guess, how to break free of that. I think there's some real useful topics in there. So man, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. It's been great to learn more about you and kind of the challenge. And you know, if you ever do another challenge like that, man, I'd be really excited to talk to you again about it.
Sure. It's been a real pleasure and an honor, Joe. And thanks so much for having me. Thank you.
Oh,
really
Niko,
appreciate it.